on there, and I can teach slope based on the triangle of that roof.
But the other thing is, when you start, let's just say that you took a group of kids to Fry Forest at the start. As a teacher, I don't know if you remember yesterday when Rose asked who had had breakfast. And people raised their hands, right? So it's a quick assessment, it's a formative assessment. And she was able to determine, I laughed, I said, who should go in line first for lunch, because they're clearly starving if they didn't raise their hand, right? It's the same thing. I'm a teacher, I'm a biology teacher. I take kids out to this forest, this Fry Forest. I say, do you guys see a problem here? And I let kids generate what the problem is. What do you see? What do you know? That's a pre-assessment. I haven't even done my unit yet on invasive species. But wouldn't it be nice if I knew where the kids were before we started? Because there'll be, if I don't, there'll be several weeks I'm gonna bore the daylights out of some of those kids who could be doing something in enrichment to prepare for the big project while the other kids are learning the basics because they don't know about some of the invasive species. You know, checking in with kids where they are. We've been doing standards in this district for a long time, and about 5 years ago, I had a first grade team when we first brought in kindergarten. They spent 3 days in the summit planning 6 weeks for what was gonna happen in their class. And the kindergarten kids showed up, and they had to bag the 6 weeks they had planned. All right, so that's another thing about planning. Right? Because you guys kill yourselves, you dig in deep, you spend all this summertime, and you're literally planning without knowing who you're going to be teaching. You have no idea if somebody at the elementary level did something in the ancient world, if it was a project that they did. I'm hoping that through Atlas Rubicon, we'll have a better communication system, and you'll be able to see all that happening right in front of you as an educator. But kids sitting in the room, what do they know? I know that kids come to us with different backgrounds. When my children sat in Laura's class, since I love Odysseus, they know everything about Greek and Romans. So my kids, right, so what did I do as a parent? What did I empower? So knowing where your kids are is part of the planning. It's part of the planning. Sometimes you're gonna need to get to know them first before you set down on what you think you're gonna do. Also, this is true. We saw the work study habits. You have classes of kids that come in with huge deficits in work study practices. The kids that can't work collaboratively, that group of kids who just, in 1 year, we don't know what went wrong, what happened to these guys, they've never done it. It becomes a focus for a grade level or becomes a focus for a team. That collaboration becomes a big instructional piece. Not that the others don't count, but you need to make adjustments because we actually teach real people that show up every year. And they have different needs. So I say this because I don't want you to cement your planning. It's got to be based on the kids that are in the room.
So I want to just take a little bit of a detour for a second. We talked about some easy entry points, right? These ideas that you might have cross-cutting standards in your district where every course or every grade has the same standards that we're measuring. You have access to the Common Core state standards, and by the way, all of those documents for the Common Core we put into our LibGuide. There's math, they're broken down into math, ELA, the content areas. We have the next generation science, the new national arts standards. They're all there for you in LibGuide. You have your work study practices, which Ellen displayed, the 3 C's and self-directed learning. Special themes, and I gave you a couple of examples of grit in our freshman year and leadership. If there are other things that you're working on in your classrooms that you want to instill in kids, weave that in. Now you'd want to make sure that you're weaving these work study practices and special themes in, not to the academic component of your project or your learning, because we want to keep the academic and the behavioral stuff separated. But it doesn't mean you can't put it on the rubric and tell kids what good community involvement looks like. Similar content, natural connections, we talked about that brainstorming, right? And we had Jackie's example of the Cape Cod house and all the different connections we could have, and the community needs. Once Ellen and I had put together a whole PowerPoint presentation on building interdisciplinary rubrics. But after we sat down and talked, we said, let's not use that, because what we really need people to understand are the entry points into developing, into interdisciplinary units. And then they need to know the habits of teachers who develop good quality rubrics.
It's because we
period.
reassessed, Michael, and we realized there was a high interest there, and they needed all the basics of it. They just
Right.
didn't know where the resources are, and there are more resources. One of them, and Rochester's gonna get them. Everyone in the school districts, the 3 school districts, are getting the QPA assessment for performance assessment handbook.
Guide, yep.
Everybody here who doesn't have a Common Core flip book needs to have one. So we
Common
need
Core
to
what?
make sure, Common Core flip book, right? So you know
So-
ELA and math. So someone like you, Jackie, you need 6 through 8, ELA and math, so you know what they are. Brian, do you have the ELA one? As
The
social
flip chart
studies teacher?
with that?
Yes.
Which
You,
one is that?
so everybody who doesn't, you have one?
Where'd you get
We need
that?
one. Everybody is getting one. See, we're getting them all. You're all gonna get one. If you're social studies, science, you're gonna get the math. We're
Why don't
gonna
you
make
pass
them
it around
available
so
so
that
you
they
have them.
They can take it together.
Right, the reason, well, it's, what it is these are the Common Core standards, right? So
Basically,
they are entry points for you on how to make connections when you're building rubrics. But it also has strategies for integration, strategies for differentiations, all these different strategies. And the last thing that Sanborn's gonna get, because yeah, the only ones are getting it. You're gonna get a flip book just for assessment. So it's gonna tell you all different ways that you can assess, and it'll include Karen Hess's chart. It's important because one of the things with differentiation is if you don't have some of these things at your fingertips, you're not thinking about the ELA standards and how they impact, or how you can simplify your connection and just go with certain targeted pieces.
Ellen,
Right.
could you do me a favor? Before, in about a second, I'm gonna ask you to pull up Hess's rigor matrix.
Is it a
Yeah.
lot?
Before, I wanna ask Ellen to pull up Hess's rigor matrix, because we had some really rich conversation yesterday around what different.
Does everybody
performance-
know what Hess's rigor matrix is?
No.
That's why I wanna show it to you. We had some pretty interesting conversation around how Ellen and I made some blanket statements. And we said, when you're building your rubrics, you shouldn't have more than 4 or 5 performance levels. In other words, if you have a 0 in your scale, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or if you're working with words, maybe something like exemplary, proficient, basic proficient, in progress, not
Can you
need.
do either one? Can you do whatever you want, either the words or the numbers?
Well, we talked about that, in that, in our district, we have a format that we're all using just the words now, okay? So you'll wanna know what your philosophy is in your building and your district before you go out and be rogue and create different rubrics, because the idea is you want kids to have that common experience coming up through the system. But we made some blanket statements, no more than 4 or 5 performance levels, and maybe 5 or 6 criteria that you're going to assess. If you start having 10 and 15 criteria, and Ellen says, if you are having to reduce your font to 8 point Times Roman just to get all that stuff in the boxes, you've gone overboard.
You're in
You have
trouble.
developed,
You're in
developed
big
rubrics
trouble.
which are not kid-friendly. And one of the main purposes of rubrics is to communicate with students about what the expectations are and where they are in terms of meeting those expectations. If kids can't understand them, and we gave an example yesterday of a very simple-looking rubric that had language in it that was clearly advanced, that had the word rudimentary.
Yeah,
in
we mentioned yesterday that use your reading specialist to help you with that. And also, you know, rubrics can be pretty, they can be fun. I think you have one, Brian, don't you have one? Is there a ship or something? You have some fun rubrics. What is yours?
Do I have one with like a race where like people are running through different stages to get to the
The
finish
band,
line?
the cake,
Yeah.
yeah, I love that, you know, because guess what? It's a material for your lesson, it's part of engagement. There are some really boring rubrics out there. You gotta pep them up. They gotta be fun for the kids, you know, they gotta see. But my personal favorite is the penguin at the elementary school, or the ice cream cone. Have you guys seen these?
No.
It's the ice cream cone, the 1 is just the cone. The 2 is the first scoop, 3 is 2 scoops, and the 4th has a little cherry on the top of it, or a little, whatever it is on top of it. The penguin's just a naked penguin. next thing he's got a vest on, next thing he has a bow tie on, next time he has a top hat on, right? The idea that kids see the progression, because I don't know if high school kids need the penguin, although they might enjoy it. I mean, it might be good for them. But the bottom line is that you have to have a graphic representation of what completeness looks like too.
I'm going to give you a couple of tips, easy tips to use. And I'll tell you that I discovered this several years ago. I was a principal of a high school in the central part of the state. And I wrote a weekly newsletter. And my wife has been a reading specialist for 33 years. All of my material was available online, and so she would read my writing. And she printed off 3 of my recent newsletter articles, and they were always theme-based. I might write an article. It wasn't, here's what's happening in our school today. It was, I would write an article, it was, you know, like an education article on interdisciplinary learning, and I would write a newsletter article for this. And my wife printed 3 of them, the most 3 recent, and she basically came in and said to me, you can't do this. She said, I ran your newsletter articles through the Lexile Analyzer, which is a free tool available online. And she said, Michael, your writing is consistently at the 1550 to 1600 Lexile range. People, it's great, it's brilliant. What you're writing is awesome and it needs to be written, but you cannot write the way you've been writing. I was not writing for my audience. I didn't realize that I was writing at such an advanced level that the parents that I was trying to communicate about the great things we were doing, they couldn't read what I was writing. So the example I can give you is if you've built a rubric and you question whether it's kid-friendly, I can tell you right now in about 5 minutes, I could launch the website for the Lexile Analyzer. I could pump some of these sentences in there and it would tell me at what level it's written at. If you've never used that tool, it's awesome. Now you have to understand, Lexile's not perfect, but it gives you a ballpark figure. If you're questioning whether your rubric is usable by kids, launch the Lexile Analyzer and drop a paragraph or a box of text into it. And if it's not coming out in the Lexile range that your kids are reading at,
and you can find out the Lexile range by looking at the information you get right at the beginning of the year about your students. You know, I know Rochester uses the NWA also, so it's going to tell us. You'll know where your Lexile average is for your class. That's information we've always had.
now Karen Hess, to get to the Hess rigor matrix. Yesterday during Rose's keynote speech, she showed a 4 or 5 minute video clip of Karen Hess. Karen Hess is from Vermont. And she's an education consultant, and she does work at the national level and also at the regional level. She does some work with the Center for Collaborative Education, which we're partnered with, and Rochester and Epping are partnered with. But she took 2 different ways of thinking about thinking. She took Webb's depth of knowledge and Bloom's taxonomy and realized that each was good for a certain purpose, but they didn't necessarily, you couldn't use Webb's for one type of need and you couldn't use Bloom's for the other type of need. And so what she looked at is, how do I marry these 2 taxonomies together into something that makes sense around depth of knowledge? And she created this rigor matrix, and it's now referred to as the Hess rigor matrix. And what it has is down this left column is Bloom's taxonomy. So if you look at Bloom's taxonomy, you see that these are very low level, right? Remember, understand. Then you start to get a little more complex. Apply, analyze, evaluate. So as you go down Bloom's taxonomy in this case, toward the evaluate, synthesize, it becomes more complex thinking. Then she took Webb's depth of knowledge, level 1, through level 4. And you remember yesterday from level 1 and level 2 are those types of questions where there are a right or wrong answer. You could probably test it with a true or false question or a multiple choice question. Levels 3 and level 4 are distinguished by the fact that they could have multiple pathways to get to one correct answer, or they can have multiple correct answers depending on the evidence that a student cites. So in the Hess rigor matrix, as you move from the upper left box down to the lower right box, these 4 boxes in this quadrant really signify high levels of thinking, deep levels of thinking. being able to apply to a novel setting. So when you're building your interdisciplinary rubrics, it's okay to have some things up in the upper left quadrant.